In this session, Gabriel Segal joins Donald Davidson to discuss theories of meaning for natural languages. Segal begins by outlining what is hoped a theory of meaning for a language might achieve. He highlights some of the problems with these aims, comparing them to aims for other scientific theories. In the course of this interchange, Davidson explains why he took the approach towards theories of meaning that he did, and why he thinks that it has a better hope of success than more traditional approaches. Next for consideration are the kinds of evidence that Davidson thinks can be used to test theories of meaning. Davidson stresses that he now thinks that what he wrote about this in The Inscrutability of Reference is wrong, and he puts forth his current view, which is that all the reason that someone could have for thinking that a speaker meant a certain thing by what they said has to come from publicly available evidence. But that is not to say that all this evidence has to be of one particular sort. Davidson even suggests that we might gain some evidence for a theory of meaning by looking inside a speaker's head. But he stresses that in doing this, we could never discover anything that couldn't be discovered by other means. Next, there comes an examination of Davidson's proposal of what form a theory of meaning should take, namely, that it should take the form of a Tarski-style truth theory. Segal asks Davidson to comment on the relationship between two aims for such a theory. First, that it should generate all and only the interpretive T-sentences. Second, that it should account for the inferential relations between sentences. And Segal suggests that there is a tension between these two aims, while Davidson strongly argues that these two aims, despite appearances, are not in fact in tension with each other. The program ends with Davidson offering an appraisal of the state of Davidsonian semantics today. He mentions a number of successes that the project has enjoyed since he first conceived of it, and indicates the area that he thinks is most problematic. We now join the discussion at the London School of Economics. I'm very pleased to introduce Gabriel Segal, Reader of Philosophy at King's College at the University of London. Gabriel has agreed to discuss with Professor Davidson the topic of theories of meaning for natural languages. Gabriel.
Thank you. Good morning, Don. A theory of meaning for a particular language, or a theory of interpretation for a particular language, in the way that you tend to often use these terms, is a theory, roughly speaking, that has all the information one would need to understand the language. Again, roughly speaking, if someone knew the theory, then they ought to be able to understand each sentence of that language. Is that right?
Yes.
Roughly.
Yes, that roughly is.
Right. I propose we blur questions about indexicals, sentences versus utterances, and so on. So let me first ask you about the purpose or value of trying to construct theories of meaning for particular languages. Am I right in thinking that there are at least the following three things we might hope to achieve? The first, and probably the simplest, is it would give us a finite but complete way of saying what it is that a competent speaker knows, or describing the competence that a speaker has. Second, it shows how language learning is possible. The difficulty there, I take it, being that language is in some sense boundless. So a competent speaker understands potentially infinitely many different sentences. And then third, it forms part of an important philosophical project of, let's say, articulating the place of linguistic semantic concepts in the natural world, or their relations to other kinds of concepts.
Yes, certainly those three things are aims of a theory of meaning, as I think of it. Perhaps there's more to be added, but that sounds good so far.
Okay, so let me ask you some questions about those. First of all, the project of showing how language learning is possible. I have two questions about that. I mean, I must admit, I find that the question itself slightly perplexing. If we're interested in whatever it might be, infectious diseases or the formation of oxbow lakes or other natural phenomena, we don't normally ask, well, how is this so much as possible?
Right.
Rather, we look at how it actually happens. So the first question is really just asking you to elaborate on why you pose that question about the possibility. And the second one, which perhaps you could answer in tandem, is how the project of constructing a theory of meaning for a speaker's language would actually address that question. Because you don't claim, of course, you're careful to resist claiming that speakers actually do know theories of meaning for their languages. So if we theorists manage to construct such a theory, that might, in some loose sense, of course, it does show how it's possible to learn language. One could learn language by learning the theory. But if that's not how we actually do it, then how does the project address the question?
Yes, I guess you just asked me two questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, why in the case of language should we raise this question? How is it possible when we don't raise the question, at least in the same way in other respects? Even I think it might be better to rephrase it a little bit, not just from the way you asked it, but from the way I've put it myself, and say, what is it about language that enables us to learn how to understand or produce a potential infinity of sentences, certainly many we've never heard, in a finite length of time. And it's clear that even leaving questions of how many sentences we could understand, it's clear that most of the sentences we produce and hear are ones that we've never produced or heard before. So it's clear that there's something that we know that enables us to do that. Now, it would be certainly very interesting to know what it is that makes it possible for us, that is, or rather, how do we do it? Obviously, we do it, so how do we do it? That's an empirical question to which I certainly don't know the answer. And so, as a philosopher, I've substituted a different but related question. How could an ordinary person do it? I guess that's the best I can do with respect to your first question. But your second question was, what's the relevance of knowing how it could be done if that's not how we do it? Well, I guess I think, I shouldn't say I guess I think, I do think that if we can describe a structure of such a sort that we see that a person could get the hang of it by, in effect, learning something about the roles of the parts of sentences and what happens when you put them together in certain ways, then the way we actually do it has some relationship to that structure that we've discovered. And now the details of how we work our way into it depends upon so many things that I don't know about. For example, how much of our learning apparatus is ready for that kind of a structure would make a huge difference in how we actually get into it. And as Chomsky and others have emphasized a lot recently, it's astonishing how quickly we do it. And it's impressive the extent to which it seems to be part of maturing. That is, there's a window of time in our lives during which we're extremely good at this. It starts fairly early, but not at once. Every sometime around 1 year or 1.5 years, we begin to get into it. And by the time we're teenagers, our ability to do much more is pretty much lost. So that makes it sound as though there's a lot that just that develops of its own, which has to do with our ability to pick up a language. So it's not as though I think learning something about the structure that's there is irrelevant to understanding how we actually do it. It just doesn't tell us in any detail.
I think I'd like to move on now to the perhaps larger philosophical project that I suggested might be the third aim of reflecting on theories of meaning. Let me just see if I've got it right. What you envisage is something like this. We have a finitely axiomatized theory that has a bunch of theoretical apparatus in it. And we understand that more or less in sort of functionalist terms, that what we need to understand about that is how the theoretical terms interrelate, how they relate to one another, to yield something like observation sentences, statements of evidence. Then we look at the statements of evidence, and it's there that we hope to relate linguistic semantic notions to other ones that are perhaps easier to understand or more basic, or at least different. And so reflecting on the internal structure of the theory of meaning on the one hand, and the nature of evidence that we could have for saying that this indeed is a correct theory of meaning, would you say that was all we could do by way of having a philosophical understanding of the place of linguistic meaning in nature? Or that that's the best thing we could do?
No, it would be wrong to say either of those things. Mm-hmm. I certainly don't think it's all that we could do, nor do I claim it's the best thing we could do. May I take a second to say something about the motivation? When I started thinking about and trying to teach philosophy of language, a lot of the work that had been done had the character of saying, let's define X means Y in a perfectly general way. And people like Ogden and Richards and various others actually tried to do exactly that. And it gradually became clear that there really wasn't any useful way of pursuing that project. And the question was, is this the best way to go about understanding the nature of language? And I think, along with others inspired by Wittgenstein and so forth, hit upon the following alternative way of thinking about language, and that was, let's see if we can, on the one hand, describe the sort of structure that a language has, and by the structure I simply mean the grammar, but where we try to get the grammar in good enough shape so that we can actually say something about how the semantic properties of sentences, at least their truth conditions, depend upon the semantic properties of the parts and the structure. And secondly, let's see if we can say how, in principle at least, somebody who didn't know that this was the structure that some particular language had, how they could decide that it was. That is, what kind of evidence could they use which would not take for granted that they already knew what you wanted to know, how they could test the correctness of this account as applied to particular speakers or groups of speakers. So this was an idea of how to make some progress with what one had been worried about in the first place by rephrasing or restating the project in a way that seemed manageable. So you can see that there's nothing in the motivation here that even suggests that this is the only thing one could do in coming to understand language, or that it's the best that one could do. It's something that you could do. And if somebody has got a better idea, then let's welcome it, not say, no, we've already got the right way of doing it.
Okay, yeah, but I take it in a sense, your answer to my question was yes. That is, you might say, yes, that's the best that I have to offer for now, or the best that I can think of.
All right, yes, that's the best I can think of, but I'm completely open-minded about the possibility of something better.
Right. But then if the question is a really philosophical one, in a way I find it a little difficult to see how there could be more to do than you suggest. I mean, I see it this way. You've in a way given up on a traditional, as it were, Socratic project of trying to give interesting, conceptually necessary and sufficient conditions for things. So we can't really hope to define meaning in any short and interesting way. And also you don't think we can reduce linguistic meaning to something else in an interesting way. Okay. But if that's so, then aren't you offering us the next best thing? A sort of conceptual map of the relationship between the concepts that we use to understand linguistic meaning and concepts we use to understand behavior and so on and so forth.
Well, if you can't produce a definition of the sort, or let's just say necessary and sufficient conditions for saying this means that, then tracing out relations between various concepts does seem to be the only alternative. But there surely are many ways of doing that. And so I don't want to claim that this is the only way of doing that.
Okay, good. So can we proceed now to questions about the evidence to which theory of meaning is answerable?
Yes.
In your article, The Inscrutability of Reference, you say something which I hope is very like this. You say, the crucial point with which I, Davidson, and with Quine may be put thus: all the evidence for or against theories of truth, interpretation, translation comes in the form of facts about what events or situations in the world cause or would cause a speaker to assent to or dissent from each sentence in the speaker's repertoire. Okay. So all the evidence for or against theories of meaning comes in the form of causal relations between events in the world and speakers assenting to or dissenting from sentences in their repertoire. Now, I find that a very interesting claim and also quite a strong claim. So perhaps if we could just reflect on that in a general sort of way. And again, if we compare or contrast theories of meaning with theories in natural sciences, do you think that there's room for that sort of claim in respect to scientific theories? I mean, do you think there might be true claims of the form, all the evidence for or against a theory of infectious diseases is, and then you could summarize it in a sentence or two? So do you think that there is room for analogous claims in the case of sciences?
No. Shall I comment on the quotation, if it is a quotation? If I wrote that, and I'm not questioning that because I just don't know, I would now say it's certainly wrong. the what it would, what I think it is legitimate to say is all the reason anybody could have for supposing that a speaker or a group of speakers mean one thing rather than another by what they say has to be publicly available evidence. That is something that other people can pick up, because otherwise we'd each just be speaking our own language and there'd be no assurance that anybody else could understand it. So meaning, I mean, since language is a social institution, it has to be socially available, that is publicly available. Now that's just an extremely general claim, and the kind of claim that indeed you can make about any science. So that's not controversial, or it shouldn't be controversial. I make that addition because I think there are some philosophers who actually don't think that's true. I think everybody knows what they mean, and other people just figure it out by luck. Whereas I think what they mean is determined by the public circumstances in which they speak. The second question is there any good reason for me or anybody else to say all of the relevant evidence is of this particular sort? No good reason to say that. The claim should rather be that one can argue that the totality of evidence of this sort, that is, evidence about the circumstances under which people assent and dissent, or would assent and dissent to their sentences, that evidence is sufficient to test the correctness of a theory. But that's not the same thing to say that that's all the evidence anybody could ever have. That would surely be wrong.
That raises the following question in my mind. Would you accept the idea that there is a certain amount of truth in behaviorism? Perhaps something that could be put like this. If two speakers are, or if two objects are identical in their dispositions, their speech dispositions in response to the environment, and their environments are suitably similar as well, I think we have to say, okay, then they mean the same things by their words.
Well, I think there's a harmless way in which that's right, but the thing that's left unsettled by that is how you characterize these dispositions. And if you are going to, I'd be dubious about the claim if the dispositions are going to be described in entirely internal terms, that is, entirely in terms of what's inside the speaker. If you're allowed to describe these dispositions in terms of the meanings, in terms of all the circumstances. How should I put this anyway? This is coming at a certain problem from a direction that I'm not quite used to thinking of it in. But let me put it briefly, but not very instructively, by saying everything depends on the vocabulary we allow ourselves in characterizing the dispositions.
Okay, so suppose we use this kind of vocabulary. The speaker is inclined to say, it's raining, or to assent to it's raining, when and only when it's raining. That sort of thing.
No, I don't think that's enough. That's essential information, all right. But in some cases, at least, something about the history of how the person has used the word in the past, or the circumstances under which the person learned to use this sentence, may be also relevant to what the person means.
Okay. I suppose what I'm trying to drive at is whether you think we're allowed to look inside people's heads.
I see. Well, we're allowed to look anywhere we want, if we can. Are we going to learn what somebody means by looking inside their heads? No, I don't think so. Though I don't want to say that it mightn't be relevant to our final conclusions. I don't think, though, any amount of peering into the head by itself will tell us what they mean.
But you do accept it might be relevant?
It might
because
be relevant, yes.
And
Certainly.
there we might find things that are, would be undetectable by other means. Undetectable in terms of the way in which the beings behave.
Certainly, looking inside anybody's head would tell me something I don't know, because I haven't looked inside of anybody's head. The question is, would we or might we learn something about what they mean that we couldn't learn from without looking inside their heads? There I would say no.
Okay, I'd like to raise another question about, loosely speaking, evidence for and against theories of meaning. This is to do with the role of inferences, either inferences that speakers ought to make or inferences that they do make. Mm-hmm. But I think perhaps in order to focus on this, we need to bring in your proposal about the form that a theory of meaning should take. Of course, your idea, which is absolutely right and ought to be uncontroversial, is that the formal work of a theory of meaning, the apparatus, the axioms that crunch out the theorems that you need, this can be done by a Tarskian truth definition or theory of truth. Okay, now, just to be clear about what we mean by that, this is a finite theory which generates theorems of the form S is true if and only if P, where S describes a sentence, like snow is white, and then we have is true if and only if, and then we have another sentence which translates, or in some sense has the same meaning as the sentence we've just specified. So we have snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. Now, what we need is a theory like this, which generates such a theorem for each sentence of the language we're interested in, but also that fails to generate any theorems that don't, any T theorems or T sentences that don't meet the requirement. So it shouldn't generate, for example, snow is white is true if and only if grass is green, or snow is white is true if and only if snow is white and 2 + 2 = 4. Okay.
Right.
Now, so that seems to be a very interesting and positive aim, to try and construct a theory that gets us the right T theorems. Okay. But that seems to be, on the face of it, quite a distinct aim from getting a theory which accounts for logical or inferential relations among sentences. But that latter thing is, of course, something that you've been interested in, and your work in theory of meaning has focused on that as well. So, for example, your account of the logical form of action sentences seems to be designed to explain why certain inferences are valid. John walked slowly, therefore John walked, and so on. So how do you conceive the relations between these two aims, one getting the right T theorems and the other explaining inferential relations among sentences?
Yes, I'll try to answer that, but let me go back just a little bit, because I was sitting here listening to what came before that and nodding my head, but I have some reservations. perhaps now is not the time to go into this, but of course Tarski didn't produce what he called theories of truth, but rather truth definitions, whereas I talk about theories of truth. So we've already taken a step away from Tarski when we make that change. And perhaps that'll come up in some other context. Secondly, the kind of theory that one gets, which really is very much like Tarski, with some alterations that don't seem to raise any difficulties in order to accommodate the presence of indexical elements in natural language. There still are lots of aspects of natural languages that we don't see now how to accommodate in such a theory. So in the end, I mean, if it were to turn out that it's impossible to do that, then we either have to say we need something richer or better or different from this sort of theory, or the whole project is a mistake, and we better think of some other way of understanding what goes on. I'm still optimistic that we'll find a way of accommodating things within pretty much the same kind of apparatus. But now, for your question, how about the inferential relations between sentences? Well, of course, the tracking the inferential relations, that is, giving truth conditions for sentences in such a way that one can prove that if one is true, another has to be true, to a large extent falls out from the project of having a finite theory. That is, we can't, each time a particular word turns up, we can't give an independent interpretation of it, or we'll soon have an infinitely large vocabulary, and our aim of explaining how a finite amount of knowledge could nevertheless tell us what new sentences mean, or how to produce them, would then be foiled. So it's not as though these two projects are independent projects. But you're right, one of the ways of thinking about how to arrive at a satisfactory finite theory is to ask, what sentences do we accept as entailing what other sentences? And that's something where we can get evidence from speakers by just noticing that whenever they are prepared to assent to this sentence, they're prepared to assent to this other one, and so on. So that's part of what constituted our original data is also data for giving a certain logical form to the sentences.
Good. I mean, that certainly seems quite true. But I take it, and that's something we should be rather cautious about. There are sort of two sides of the same coin we have to be cautious about. One is, of course, sometimes speakers don't see the logical relations. I don't know how much we think of classical logic as being, as it were, the right logic to impose upon them. But notoriously, of course, in logic classes, right from the beginning, students object. For example, it doesn't follow that from not P, that therefore if P then Q. So presumably we'd have to be careful about that. But the other thing that perhaps worries me a bit more is that what accounts for somebody's thinking that if a certain sentence is true, then another one is true or must be true, of course might well go far beyond what's in the truth theory. even cases that initially seemed like the kind of cases we ought to capture with a semantic theory, often are not thus capturable. So to borrow an example from David Wiggins, if it's true that most Fs are Gs, then it's true that there's at least one F. But that's something you'd never be able to prove with just a truth theory. You need a small amount of mathematics in addition, or something like that.
Well, either that, or perhaps you can add to the truth theory quantifiers like most.
That still won't capture the inference.
Yes, well, I think there are two ways to go at that point. I mean, there are many points at which there are two, or there are various possibilities, and just saying, let's end up with a theory of this sort, won't tell you which way to go. And I think that's a good example. Should one consider that to be a matter of logic, or should one consider it to be an inference that we tend to make, but where it doesn't follow from logic, but it just seems sensible under most of the conditions in which we're inclined to say this sort of thing. And if you are inclined to stick with the kind of logic we understand best, then you will also be inclined to say that a lot of inferences that we commonly make are not logical inferences. That doesn't mean they aren't perfectly good ways of reasoning, but we'll account for those ways of reasoning in a different way than supposing that they just follow from the meanings of the words, so to speak.
I believe a lot of mathematics falls under that rubric, doesn't it?
Well, mathematics is a good example, all right. I mean, how much of that to count as logic it is up for grabs, and there are good reasons for purists to resist, including all of mathematics, or let's say set theory, as a part of basic logic.
Okay, I'd like to pursue this just a little bit more, because it seems to me that you'd like to have, as it were, the logic of the language, or real logic, being that very same logic that is used in the truth theory, which is doing the work of the theory of meaning, which is generating the T theorems.
Right.
Okay. And I guess I myself have a worry about that, particularly given the point I made earlier, that the truth theory must not be overproductive. It mustn't, in addition to proving the theorems you do want, also prove ones that you don't want, uninterpretive ones. So, given that, it turns out, one way or another, you're going to have to put serious limitations on the apparatus you use to prove the T theorems. Either you simply start out with a small number of logical rules, which would be less than a normal complete logic. Or you somehow have all the rules in there, but then you tell yourself you're only allowed to use some subset, the so-called canonical proof procedure. But either way, the actual rules of inference you're using in the T theory are nothing like a complete logic. And so it seems to me that then, in order to account for even logical inferential relations among sentences, we're going to have to add some things into the apparatus that you need just for getting the T theorems right. And so the questions actually do remain rather independent of each other.
Well, I'm inclined to say let the theorems flow, but let's think of ways to pick out the right theorems as the ones that we say are the ones that somebody has to know in order to understand a speaker. So the idea of picking out certain theorems in favor of the others when we're saying that we're using the theory to describe what a competent speaker or interpreter knows. It certainly doesn't have to know all of the things that follow from the axioms of the theory, because a lot of those are going to be very far out. It doesn't seem to me to be impossible to pick out the ones that we are pinning on, so to speak, the competent interpreter or speaker.
Okay, so perhaps we should try and pursue that a little bit. I'm not sure I fully understand the answer. I'm not sure I fully understand my question. So let me see if I can get clearer about these two things. I mean, my concern was just this, that well, I guess there are two sides to it. There are two distinguishable aims one might have. Aim one, to get all and only the right T-theorems. And aim two, to explain inferential relations among sentences. And then I suggested further that if we're working within truth theories, doing duty for theories of meaning, these two aims tend to pull in opposite directions in certain respects, in particular in respect of the desire to get the right T-theorems, but also to restrain the theory from proving the wrong ones, requires one to have a very limited, emaciated kind of logic in the truth theory. But we want a far richer one, let me put it that way, to explain even the purely logical inferential relations among sentences. Now, I wasn't quite sure how what you said addressed that sort of concern.
Well, my own way of thinking of it is not to try to restrict the logic of the meta-language, nor to prevent the production of endless theorems which I, as the perpetrator of this theory, am not interested in attributing to knowledgeable speakers and interpreters. Maybe I should just step back an inch here and say, I don't think of the theory that we're talking about as something that the competent speaker or interpreter has. I don't make any claims about ordinary people in some sense or other having the axioms of the theory and so forth. I think of the theory as being mine. It's my way, the only way I know, to say what all the things are that the competent speaker and interpreter knows. So I want all those things to be consequences of the theory, but I don't mind if there are lots of other consequences, as long as I can pick out the ones that I want to say. Those are the things the competent speaker has to know. Of course, if he knows some of these other things, that's great. And I think myself that in some fairly clear way, speakers, in fact, do know some of the axioms. I mean, not that they would put it this way, but people know that if a conjunction is true, each of the conjuncts is, even if they're not willing to say that, and don't have the words for saying it, and so forth, by a process of sort of Socratic questioning of the sort that you find in the Meno, you could persuade yourself or persuade them that they know this. When it comes to the apparatus for explaining quantification, I'm not quite so confident about it, or let's say I have very little confidence. So the most I'm willing to say there is something that I hope is a tautology, and that is, since people know all of the T sentences, and those we can roughly characterize, since they know all of that, and that is an infinity of things, there must be something in them that has produced all of this knowledge, or accounts for the fact that they have all of that knowledge, and accounts for it in a finite way. That seems to be a tautology. I mean, it's meant to be, at least. So one of the pressures that you're trying to impose on me, I don't feel, because I'm not trying to cut the theory down to size. All I want is enough. I want to get enough from the theory, and I don't care if there's more that the theory produces.
So suppose you've got a truth theory which entails both snow is white is true if and only if snow is white, and say snow is white is true if and only if snow is white, and either it's raining or it's not raining.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, as far as the theory is concerned, of course, these are just indifferently things that it proves.
Right.
But then what means are you going to use to specify the things that you do wish to attribute to the speaker, namely knowledge of a particular subset of the theorems?
Sure. I've never felt the need, which some people think I should, to find a mechanical way of getting rid of those. Before one looks for a mechanical way of doing it, it seems to me it's worth asking first, would it do any harm to think of those also as things that people know? There's no gain in adding those on, but is there any loss? So that would be that particular kind of case, because there are several different sorts of cases that one can think about. And the second one is, if you have two views about what to impute to the competent speaker and interpreter, and one is a lot simpler than the other, but accounts for everything, then it's just a general rule in any science that you pick the simpler one, and it's easy here.
Yeah, that's true, but I think it brings me back to my worry of the question of simpler theory that does what in particular, because if you want a theory which generates all only the interpretive T theorems, then you can get a very simple one. If you start wanting to account for inferences as well, then you have to complicate it simply by adding in more rules of inference.
Well, you don't have to add any rules of inference to see that you all, even if you don't attribute to people as part of their necessary information, these T sentences that have the extraneous thing on them, nevertheless, we already have given a semantics that shows that follows from what they know, and so if they're to the extent that they reason according to what they seem to be committed to, they'd be willing to reason to this. So it's not as though we've eliminated that as something that they can think of.
I was suggesting we don't already have a semantics, which that's a consequence. So I was suggesting that it's possible, if it's possible to construct an interpretive T theory for a natural language at all, then it's possible to do it with 3 or 4 rules of inference, something much less than a complete logic. So that would be the simplest theory which meets that aim alone.
Well, here we certainly have as one of our logical constants. In other words, part of the amount of logic that we have to attribute to people in order to make any sense of them at all is you can't turn a true sentence false by conjoining with it a true sentence. So we've already got that. Now, assuming that we've left arithmetic out as part of logic, of course, then we're not going to say they necessarily will accept this other T sentence simply because the logic hasn't shown that 2 + 2 = 4 is true. But we weren't putting mathematics into our basic logic anyway. So.
Okay. So suppose we have something like I don't know. John is tall, therefore something is tall. Existential generalization.
Right.
There are 2 ways we could try and bring that into the T theory. One, we could just have it as some kind of a priori constraint. We feel in advance, as perhaps you do, that it's a constraint on correct interpretation that we attribute at least this much logic to the speaker we're talking about. Okay. The other way is we could aim to get a truth theory for this speaker's language, which generated all and only the right T theorems. And then we could simply look and see at what apparatus we needed for that. And I'd be willing to make the strong claim that if we do that, we won't find existential generalization in there. Okay. It's not needed just for the crunching out of the T theorems. So you don't seem happy with that.
Well, I'm just not sure I got it. I guess I stopped following what you were saying because I was so unhappy with the example.
Okay, sorry. It's a bad one.
Because I don't know a good way of incorporating adjectives like tall into my semantics. That's a terrible admission, but I don't know a really satisfactory way of doing that, and I don't know what that tells us, but it tells us something, all right, because it isn't just a matter of failing to get the inference into the system. It's a failure to know how to handle the semantics of adjectives of that sort right off the bat. So whether the right way of handling the semantics of that would make that a valid inference, I don't know.
Okay, that's good. But so you do accept anyway that the question of how we account for the validity of that particular inference isn't automatically, but the question of whether that's going to be accounted for by the theory that we use to account for, say, tall.
Yeah.
That does remain. We might need to bring in something further. Right. Good. So this might be a good time to ask the last question, something that you raised before when you said you were still optimistic.
Yes.
And you've just shown very slight course of pessimism in the case of is tall. You used occasionally to end articles with a list of conundrums and problems,
Yes.
technical ones,
Right.
for the theory of meaning, constructions of natural language that we don't know how to account for
Right.
in the truth theory. So, how do you feel things have gone so far? What do you think? Where do you think particularly good progress has been made? And what are the really outstanding problems that remain?
Well, I'm not sure I can dredge up on the spur of the moment a list of all the problems. There's so many.
Yeah, just your favourites.
I see.
Your favourite pluses and minuses.
I see. Well, pluses would include the semantics of events, which seems to me to have slowly gained a foothold, and how some linguists think about these things, and even among philosophers. And that, of course, helps clear up quite a number of problems and talk about causality and action and so on. And I think Stephen Neal's work on various kinds of quantifiers is another rosy area, because it brings a lot of things under some degree of control, which weren't before. So I think they're a list. I think we have a better idea of the kinds of things we might say about proper names than we once did. But I think the list of what I would think of as successes is fair. Well, it's certainly finite, but it's not trivial. Then there are some things which I haven't written about, but where I think I see a way, because I'm willing to introduce indexical elements which are to some extent hidden from sight in a lot of places in our understanding of natural language. And that, for example, is a hint as to how I would try to handle counterfactuals. But also let's say statements about necessity and possibility and so on. Let's see, what was the other half? The other half was, where do things look dark? Well, I just mentioned one. There are those badly behaved adjectives and adverbs, of which there are quite a lot. And that seems to me one of the worst problems, just because it doesn't involve something that seems to us in any natural sense mysterious. We cope with these things extremely easily, and it makes one worry that somehow or other we're not using a good enough or right apparatus in explaining how natural language works. So that's an example, anyway, of what seems to me to be a serious difficulty. Others of equal seriousness don't easily occur to me. However, I might say that when I first was becoming aware of the extent to which Tarski's work allows us to take seriously problems that philosophers had been trying to cope with for a long time, but hadn't had any rules for telling when they got it right or when they got it wrong. And here you could say, well, they've got it right if you can accommodate it in this framework. That seemed to me a tremendous advance, at least in my own thinking. And I remember sitting down with my friend and once upon a time student, John Wallace, and we were so optimistic that we sat down with some novel, I can't remember which it was, and said, let's work out the logical form of each sentence as we go along. And we never even got through the first sentence.